Every morning, Judge Marcus Thompson woke up at the crack of dawn. He liked to start his day early, sipping a cup of coffee while looking out the window at the quiet streets coming alive with the first light of the sun. As a respected judge, he carried a deep sense of responsibility on his shoulders. For years, he had worked tirelessly to ensure fairness in the justice system, striving to make it better not just for himself, but for everyone who walked through the courthouse doors. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. The air seemed heavier than usual, and Judge Thompson couldn't quite shake the feeling that today might be unlike any other. He dressed in his usual sharp suit, grabbed his briefcase filled with case files, and headed out the door. The drive to the courthouse was uneventful, but as he parked his car and stepped onto the wide stone steps leading to the entrance, he noticed an unusual buzz among the people gathered outside. The line to get inside was longer than normal, which wasn't entirely surprising given the high-profile cases scheduled for the day. But there was something else, a tension in the air, almost like invisible threads pulling tight between the people waiting. Some whispered nervously, others checked their phones repeatedly, and a few glanced over their shoulders as if expecting something unexpected to happen. Judge Thompson shook off the unease and joined the queue, reminding himself that delays were simply part of the job. Inside the courthouse, security checkpoints were standard procedure. Everyone had to pass through metal detectors, have their bags scanned, and show identification before proceeding further. Usually, this process went smoothly for Judge Thompson. People recognized him, nodded respectfully, and let him move ahead without much fuss. Today, though, things felt different even here. There was a new face manning the checkpoint, a young officer named Ryan Collins. Officer Collins stood tall and alert, his uniform crisp and his expression serious. It was his first week assigned to courthouse duty, and he was determined to do everything by the book. Earlier that morning, he'd received instructions about increased vigilance due to vague reports of a possible threat nearby. No specifics were provided, only a general warning to stay cautious. This left Collins feeling uneasy, unsure of what, or whom, to watch out for. As Judge Thompson approached the front of the line, Officer Collins stepped forward. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the man in front of him. Something about the way Judge Thompson carried himself caught Collins's attention. His posture was confident, almost commanding, but the officer pushed those observations aside and focused on protocol. "Sir," Collins said firmly, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the crowd, "can I see your ID, please?" Judge Thompson paused mid-step, taken aback by the request. He had been coming to this courthouse for years, and while occasional checks weren't uncommon, they typically involved little more than a quick glance at his credentials. Without saying a word, he reached into his pocket and handed over his identification card. Officer Collins took it, scanning the details carefully. When he saw the title, Honorable Judge Marcus Thompson, his eyebrows shot up in surprise. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across Collins's face. He hadn't expected to encounter someone so prominent during this shift. But protocol dictated that certain procedures couldn't be skipped, no matter who was involved. Taking a deep breath, Collins looked back at Judge Thompson and said, "Please wait here, sir. I need to confirm this." Then, stepping aside, he radioed for additional instructions. The seconds ticked by slowly as Judge Thompson stood there, his patience wearing thin. Around him, the murmurs grew louder as curious onlookers began to realize who was being questioned. Some exchanged knowing glances, others pulled out their phones to capture the scene unfolding before them. What had started as a routine morning was quickly turning into something far more complicated, and neither man could have predicted how profoundly this moment would change both their lives. Officer Ryan Collins stood frozen for a moment, gripping Judge Marcus Thompson's ID card tightly in his hand. The weight of the situation pressed down on him as he glanced between the credentials and the man standing calmly in front of him. There was no denying it. This wasn't just any ordinary citizen. This was a judge, a person whose authority rivaled that of anyone in the courthouse, including law enforcement officers like himself. But despite the clear title printed on the card, Officer Collins hesitated. His mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of mistake? Could someone forge such official-looking documents? He had been trained to trust his instincts, but also to follow protocol no matter what. And protocol dictated that if something seemed off, even slightly, he needed to investigate further. So, after taking a deep breath, he spoke firmly. "Sir, please stay right here while I confirm this." Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, though his expression remained composed. Years of presiding over courtrooms had taught him how to maintain his composure under pressure. Still, there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely. He nodded once, silently agreeing to comply. But inside, his thoughts churned. This has happened before, he thought bitterly. Not to him personally, but to countless others who looked like him. Black professionals stopped or questioned because of assumptions based on their appearance rather than their accomplishments. As Officer Collins stepped aside to radio for confirmation, the tension in the room grew palpable. People around them began whispering, craning their necks to see what was happening. Some recognized Judge Thompson immediately. Others didn't know him but could sense the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. A few pulled out their phones, capturing the scene discreetly, or not so discreetly. Word spread quickly among those in line, and soon, all eyes were on the two men at the center of the commotion. Back near the metal detector, another officer arrived to assist. She was older, with years of experience etched into her face. Her presence seemed to calm Officer Collins somewhat, though his unease lingered. Together, they reviewed Judge Thompson's ID again, comparing it to records on their radios. Meanwhile, backup security personnel began gathering nearby, creating an increasingly intimidating atmosphere. For Judge Thompson, the situation felt surreal. Here he was, a man whose life's work revolved around upholding justice, being treated like someone under suspicion. Every second that passed felt heavier than the last. Yet, instead of lashing out or raising his voice, he chose to remain silent, observing everything with quiet intensity. He noticed the nervous glances exchanged between the officers, the way some avoided making eye contact with him altogether. It was a familiar dynamic, one he'd seen play out countless times in courtrooms, where bias often lurked beneath the surface of professionalism. Finally, after several agonizing minutes, Officer Collins returned, holding the ID card awkwardly in his hand. "Your credentials check out, sir," he said, his tone polite but still tinged with hesitation. "You're free to proceed." Relief washed over Judge Thompson, but only briefly. As he took back his ID and moved toward the metal detector, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Frustration, exhaustion, and even a hint of sadness. He knew this wasn't about Officer Collins specifically. It was about a system that allowed moments like this to happen repeatedly, chipping away at trust and dignity bit by bit. The crowd parted as Judge Thompson walked through the checkpoint, the murmurs growing louder behind him. Someone muttered, "That's Judge Thompson." Another whispered, "Can't believe they stopped him." But Judge Thompson tuned them out, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. For now, he was determined to get to his chambers and prepare for the day ahead. Little did he, or Officer Collins, know that this encounter was far from over. In fact, it was only the beginning of a chain of events that would leave a lasting impact on both their lives. And as Judge Thompson disappeared down the hallway, Officer Collins stood there, staring after him. Doubts gnawed at him. Had he done the right thing? Or had he let fear and uncertainty cloud his judgment? Whatever the answer, one thing was certain. This morning had changed something within him, planting a seed of reflection that would grow in the days to come. As Judge Marcus Thompson walked away from the security checkpoint, his footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors of the courthouse. Though he appeared calm on the outside, his mind was anything but peaceful. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by a flood of thoughts and emotions that had been building up for years. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered something like this. It was just another chapter in a story all too familiar to him and countless others who shared his skin color. He thought back to conversations with friends and colleagues, many of whom were also black professionals. They often swapped stories about moments when they'd been questioned or scrutinized simply because of how they looked. A doctor stopped while entering a hospital late at night. A lawyer asked to prove their identity before being allowed into a meeting. Even a university professor once told Judge Thompson about being mistaken for janitorial staff during a conference. These weren't isolated incidents. They were threads woven into the fabric of daily life for so many people. And now, here he was, a judge, no less, facing the same kind of treatment. What made it even harder to swallow was knowing that these experiences weren't just inconvenient or embarrassing. They carried a deeper weight, chipping away at a person's sense of dignity over time. It wasn't anger that consumed Judge Thompson in that moment. It was exhaustion. How many times could someone smile politely, explain themselves patiently, and brush off indignities before it started to wear them down? He knew the answer. More times than anyone should have to endure. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Collins stood rooted to his spot near the metal detector, watching Judge Thompson disappear down the hallway. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his belt, his radio crackling faintly in the background. The knot in his stomach tightened with every passing second. He replayed the scene in his head, dissecting each decision he'd made. Had he overreacted, or had he simply done his job? Officer Collins had always prided himself on following the rules. Growing up, he'd dreamed of becoming a police officer, inspired by stories of bravery and service. But now, standing in the middle of this grand courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he'd missed something important. Maybe following the rules wasn't enough if it meant treating someone unfairly along the way. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the line began moving again, Collins noticed the lingering stares from bystanders. Some looked sympathetic, while others seemed judgmental. One older woman gave him a disapproving glance before shaking her head and walking away. Another man muttered under his breath, "That poor guy." Collins didn't need to hear the words to know what they meant. He already felt the weight of their unspoken criticism pressing down on him. The truth was, Collins hadn't expected to face such a moral dilemma so early in his career. Sure, he'd dealt with difficult situations before, but nothing quite like this. Stopping a judge, questioning someone whose very role was tied to justice itself. It felt surreal, almost absurd. Yet, as much as he wanted to justify his actions, to tell himself that he was just doing his duty, he couldn't ignore the nagging doubt creeping into his mind. For a brief moment, Collins imagined what it must feel like to be in Judge Thompson's shoes. What would it be like to walk into a place where you belonged, only to be treated as though you didn't? To carry your achievements proudly, only to have them questioned or dismissed without cause? The thought unsettled him deeply. Collins glanced around at the bustling courthouse, taking in the sea of faces moving past him. Lawyers clutching folders, clerks rushing to their desks, jurors waiting nervously for instructions. It was a microcosm of society, full of people from different walks of life. And yet, not everyone experienced it in the same way. That realization hit Collins like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he began to understand that fairness wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about seeing people for who they truly were. By the time his shift ended later that day, Collins found himself unable to stop thinking about the encounter. Every detail, the judge's quiet composure, the murmurs of the crowd, the weight of his own decisions, replayed in his mind like a film stuck on repeat. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to make things right. All he needed was the courage to take the first step. The tension in the courthouse didn't end with Judge Marcus Thompson walking away. In fact, it only escalated. As he approached the metal detector once again, this time to actually go through it, the backup officers who had arrived earlier seemed determined to make up for lost time. One of them stepped forward, his voice firm but tinged with unease. "Sir, we'll need to check your briefcase," he said, gesturing toward the sleek leather bag Judge Thompson carried. Judge Thompson stopped in his tracks, his patience finally wearing thin. He turned slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto the officer's face. For a moment, there was complete silence, the kind that made everyone nearby hold their breath. Then, in a voice steady yet charged with emotion, Judge Thompson spoke. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "I'm not just some random person walking in off the street. I'm a judge. You're questioning me. A sitting judge, as if I'm a suspect." The room froze. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to dim in that moment. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others avoided eye contact altogether. It wasn't just the authority in Judge Thompson's voice that silenced them. It was the undeniable truth behind his words. Here was a man whose very presence symbolized justice, fairness, and integrity, and yet he was being treated as though he were guilty until proven innocent. For Officer Ryan Collins, standing nearby, the scene was unbearable. He watched as the situation spiraled further out of control, the initial stop snowballing into something far more serious. What had started as a routine security check had turned into a public spectacle, with whispers spreading like wildfire among the crowd. People craned their necks to see what was happening. Phones were raised discreetly to capture the moment, and murmurs of disbelief rippled through the line. Someone muttered, "This is unbelievable." Another whispered, "They really don't know who they're dealing with." But Judge Thompson wasn't finished. His frustration boiled over, and for the first time that morning, his composure cracked. "You want to search my briefcase," he continued, his tone rising slightly. "Fine. Go ahead. But understand this. When you treat someone like me this way, you're not just affecting me. You're sending a message to everyone else who looks like me. A message that says no matter what you achieve, no matter how hard you work, you'll always be seen as less than. Is that the message you want to send?" His words hung heavy in the air, resonating deeply with those around him. Many nodded in agreement, while others looked away, ashamed. Even the officers seemed taken aback, their confidence faltering under the weight of his argument. One by one, they stepped back, realizing they had crossed a line. Reluctantly, they allowed Judge Thompson to pass without searching his briefcase, though the damage had already been done. As Judge Thompson finally walked through the metal detector and disappeared down the hallway, the atmosphere in the courthouse shifted dramatically. The crowd began to disperse, but the tension remained palpable. Conversations erupted in hushed tones, with people debating what they had just witnessed. Some defended the officers, insisting they were just doing their job. Others sided with Judge Thompson, calling the entire ordeal unnecessary and humiliating. Officer Collins stood frozen, watching as the drama unfolded around him. He felt a mix of emotions, shame, guilt, and confusion, all swirling together in a storm inside his mind. He had never imagined that a routine morning at work could turn into such a defining moment. The image of Judge Thompson's piercing gaze lingered in his memory, along with the sting of his powerful words. Later that day, as Collins sat alone in the break room, replaying the events in his head, he realized something important. This wasn't just about him or Judge Thompson. It was about a system that allowed moments like this to happen, a system where bias, even unintentional, could lead to situations that hurt individuals and communities alike. And for the first time in his career, Collins began to question whether simply following orders was enough. Wasn't there a better way? A fairer way? The incident may have ended, but its impact would ripple far beyond the courthouse walls. For Judge Thompson, it reinforced the ongoing struggle for equality and respect. For Officer Collins, it planted a seed of reflection that would grow in the days to come. And for everyone who witnessed it, it served as a stark reminder of the power dynamics at play in everyday life and the urgent need for change. By the time the courthouse settled back into its usual rhythm, Judge Marcus Thompson had already made a decision. He could have filed a formal complaint against Officer Ryan Collins and the other officers involved. It would have been within his rights, and many in his position might have chosen that path. But as he sat in his chambers later that afternoon, staring at the stack of case files on his desk, he realized something. Punishing one officer wouldn't solve the bigger problem. What mattered most wasn't revenge or retribution, it was understanding. Instead of taking disciplinary action, Judge Thompson requested a private meeting with Officer Collins. The request surprised everyone, including Collins himself. When he received the message, his stomach churned with anxiety. He couldn't imagine what Judge Thompson wanted to say to him. Was this going to be a dressing down? A lecture about professionalism? Or worse, was he being set up for some kind of public humiliation? Despite his fears, Collins agreed to the meeting. That evening, after the courthouse had emptied out and the halls grew quiet, he found himself standing outside Judge Thompson's chambers. Taking a deep breath, he knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," came the judge's voice from inside. When Collins entered, he saw Judge Thompson seated behind a large wooden desk, surrounded by shelves lined with legal books and framed awards. The room exuded authority, but there was also an air of calmness that put Collins slightly at ease. Judge Thompson gestured for him to sit, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Finally, Judge Thompson broke the ice. "Officer Collins," he began, his tone measured but not unkind, "I don't want to ruin your career." The words caught Collins off guard. He had braced himself for anger or blame, but this was unexpected. "But I need you to understand why what happened today matters, not just for me, but for everyone who looks like me." Collins nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. Judge Thompson leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady and piercing. "You stopped me because protocol told you to," he continued. "And maybe you thought you were doing the right thing. But let me ask you something. When you looked at me, what did you see? Did you see a judge? Or did you see a black man walking through the courthouse doors?" The question hit Collins like a punch to the chest. He opened his mouth to answer but found no words. Instead, he stared down at his hands, clenched tightly in his lap. Judge Thompson didn't wait for a response. He went on, his voice softening slightly but still carrying weight. "Every day, people like me walk into places where we belong. In boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, and we're treated as though we don't. We're questioned, doubted, scrutinized. And it's exhausting. Not because it happens once, but because it happens over and over again." For Collins, hearing these words was like looking into a mirror he hadn't known existed. He thought back to the moment he'd first approached Judge Thompson at the security checkpoint. Had he hesitated because of the title on the ID card, or because of something deeper, something unconscious? The realization unsettled him, forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd never examined before. Judge Thompson paused, giving Collins time to absorb everything he'd said. Then, in a gentler tone, he added, "I'm telling you this not to make you feel guilty, but to help you understand. You hold power in your hands every day. How you use it shapes lives. It can either build trust or break it. And I believe you're capable of making the right choices if you take the time to think about them." As the conversation unfolded, Collins began to open up. At first, his responses were hesitant, almost defensive. But as Judge Thompson listened patiently, offering insights without judgment, Collins relaxed. He admitted that he hadn't intended to embarrass or disrespect anyone. He'd simply been following orders. "But now I see," he said quietly, "that it's not enough to just follow rules. I have to think about why I'm following them." By the end of their talk, both men felt a shift. For Judge Thompson, it was a sense of hope, that meaningful conversations could lead to change. For Collins, it was a newfound awareness of the impact his actions could have on others. As they shook hands and parted ways, neither knew exactly what the future held. But one thing was certain. This meeting had planted a seed of understanding that would grow far beyond the walls of the courthouse. In the days that followed, Collins couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. He replayed Judge Thompson's words in his mind, letting them sink in deeper each time. Slowly but surely, he began to see his role as more than just enforcing rules. It was about. In the weeks following his meeting with Judge Marcus Thompson, Officer Ryan Collins found himself unable to shake off the weight of their conversation. It replayed in his mind during quiet moments, on patrol, while filling out paperwork, even as he lay awake at night. The judge's words had struck a chord deep within him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own biases and assumptions. For the first time in his career, Collins realized that being a good officer wasn't just about following orders. It was about understanding the humanity of the people he served. Determined to do better, Collins decided to take action. He began attending workshops on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity, something he'd never considered before. At first, he felt out of place among the other attendees, many of whom were seasoned professionals discussing topics he barely understood. But as the sessions progressed, Collins started to see patterns in his own behavior, small, seemingly harmless decisions that could add up to create barriers between law enforcement and the community. One workshop leader emphasized the importance of seeing people beyond the uniform, a phrase that stuck with Collins long after the session ended. At the same time, Collins joined a local initiative aimed at improving police-community relations. The program brought officers together with residents from diverse backgrounds to discuss shared challenges and build trust. During one meeting, a young black woman stood up and shared her experience of being pulled over multiple times for no apparent reason. Her voice trembled as she described how those encounters made her feel not just frustrated, but invisible and dehumanized. Collins listened intently, recognizing echoes of Judge Thompson's story in her words. When it was his turn to speak, he admitted, "I've been part of the problem, but I'm here because I want to be part of the solution." Meanwhile, Judge Thompson continued using his platform to advocate for change within the courthouse. Inspired by his conversation with Collins, he pushed for reforms in security protocols to ensure fairness and respect for everyone who entered the building. He proposed training programs for courthouse staff and officers, focusing not only on procedural rules, but also on empathy and communication skills. His efforts weren't always met with enthusiasm. Some colleagues dismissed his ideas as unnecessary or too idealistic, but Judge Thompson refused to back down. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he reminded them. "But if we don't start somewhere, nothing will ever improve." Slowly but surely, small shifts began to take root. Security personnel at the courthouse started greeting visitors with warmer smiles and clearer explanations when checks were necessary. Officers became more mindful of how they approached individuals, taking extra care to acknowledge titles and credentials promptly. Even the atmosphere in the courthouse seemed lighter, less tense than before. While these changes might have gone unnoticed by some, they meant the world to those who had once felt marginalized or disrespected. Judge Thompson noticed fewer complaints from colleagues of color about being singled out or treated unfairly. One day, an attorney stopped him in the hallway to thank him for pushing for the new training initiatives. "It's making a difference," she said sincerely. "People are starting to feel like they belong here again." Those words filled Judge Thompson with a quiet pride, knowing that his work was helping to create a more inclusive environment. Though their paths rarely crossed after that initial meeting, both men carried its lessons with them every day. For Collins, it was a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that his actions mattered far beyond the badge he wore. For Judge Thompson, it was proof that even in moments of conflict, dialogue could pave the way for growth and understanding. Together, though indirectly, they were planting seeds of change that would continue to grow, shaping not just their own lives, but also the lives of countless others who walked through the courthouse doors. As months passed, the incident faded into memory for most people, reduced to little more than office gossip or a fleeting headline. But for those directly involved, it remained a turning point, a moment that challenged them to reflect, learn, and evolve. And while neither man could predict what the future held, they both knew one thing for certain. Their choices had already begun to ripple outward, creating waves of impact far greater than either of them could have imagined. Months had passed since that fateful morning at the courthouse, and life for both Judge Marcus Thompson and Officer Ryan Collins had settled into a new rhythm. Yet neither man could deny how profoundly their encounter had shaped their paths. The incident itself may have faded from public memory, but its effects lingered, quietly, steadily, like ripples spreading across a still pond. For Officer Collins, the changes were evident in his daily work. What began as attending workshops and joining community initiatives soon grew into a personal mission to reshape how he approached his role as an officer. One evening, standing before a group of cadets during a training session, Collins found himself sharing his story openly for the first time. His hands trembled slightly as he recounted the details of stopping Judge Thompson, the hesitation, the protocol, the uncomfortable realization that followed. "I made a mistake," Collins admitted, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "But I learned from it, and because of that, I've become part of the solution instead of perpetuating the problem." The room fell silent, the young cadets hanging on to every word. Some scribbled notes furiously. Others simply stared, wide-eyed, as if seeing their future responsibilities in a new light. For many of them, this was the first time they'd heard an officer speak so candidly about vulnerability and growth. Collins's bravery earned him respect not only among his peers, but also within the community. Residents who once viewed officers with suspicion began approaching him with questions or concerns, trusting that he would listen without judgment. At one neighborhood meeting, an elderly woman thanked him for taking the time to understand her perspective. "You're different," she said softly, patting his arm. "Keep doing what you're doing." Those simple words stayed with Collins long after the meeting ended, fueling his determination to continue growing. Inside the courthouse, subtle yet meaningful transformations were taking place under Judge Thompson's guidance. Security measures remained strict, as they should be, but interactions grew more respectful and informed. Officers now greeted visitors by name whenever possible, offering clear explanations when additional checks were required. Even the way people moved through the metal detectors felt less tense, more collaborative. The atmosphere shifted from one of guarded caution to mutual understanding. Judge Thompson noticed these changes keenly. Colleagues who had once complained about being singled out stopped mentioning such incidents altogether. One afternoon, while chatting with a fellow judge in the cafeteria, he overheard a court clerk remark, "Things feel lighter around here lately." The comment brought a small smile to his face. It wasn't perfection. He knew there was still work to be done, but it was progress. And progress, no matter how incremental, mattered deeply to him. The ripple effects extended beyond the courthouse walls, too. Stories of the incident, and the subsequent efforts to improve relations, spread throughout the city. Local news outlets highlighted the training programs and community initiatives, praising the individuals involved for their willingness to confront difficult truths. Judge Thompson became a symbol of quiet resilience, while Officer Cousins emerged as proof that accountability could lead to transformation. One particularly memorable moment came when Collins received an invitation to speak at a regional law enforcement conference. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of officers, he shared his journey, from the day he stalked Judge Thompson to the ongoing process of learning and unlearning. "We all make mistakes," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "What defines us isn't the error itself, but what we choose to do afterward. If we can turn moments of conflict into opportunities for growth, we can change not just ourselves but the entire system." As the audience erupted into applause, Collins glanced toward the back of the room. There, seated quietly, was Judge Thompson. Their eyes met briefly, and though neither man smiled or waved, the acknowledgement between them was unmistakable. This wasn't just about two men anymore. It was about a shared commitment to creating a better, fairer world. Years later, when reflecting on this chapter of their lives, both Judge Thompson and Officer Collins would agree. The true measure of their actions lay not in immediate results but in the seeds they planted. Seeds of empathy, understanding, and hope that continued to grow, branching outward to touch countless lives. They may never fully know the extent of their impact, but perhaps that was the beauty of it. Change, after all, rarely announces itself with fanfare. More often, it unfolds quietly, one conversation, one decision, one person at a time. Years rolled by, and the courthouse where Judge Marcus Thompson and Officer Ryan Collins once crossed paths became a symbol of quiet progress. The incident that had once stirred tension and discomfort was now remembered as a turning point, a moment when two men chose understanding over division, paving the way for broader change. Though their lives continued along separate paths, the legacy of their connection endured, shaping not only their personal journeys, but also the communities they served. Judge Thompson eventually retired, leaving behind a career marked not just by legal victories, but by his unwavering commitment to fairness and reform. On his final day at the courthouse, colleagues gathered to honor him with speeches and heartfelt words. One attorney stood up and said, "Judge Thompson didn't just preside over cases, he changed lives. He taught us that justice isn't just about laws, it's about people." As Thompson listened, he couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come since that morning years ago. The courthouse was no longer just a building. It was a place where trust was rebuilt, one interaction at a time. Meanwhile, Officer Collins rose through the ranks, earning promotions not because of accolades or dramatic acts of heroism, but because of his dedication to fostering relationships between law enforcement and the community. His peers often joked that he had become the department's unofficial ambassador, always eager to bridge gaps and encourage open dialogue. When asked about his philosophy, Collins would smile and say, "Every person deserves respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. That's something I learned the hard way, and it's something I'll never forget." Though their careers took different directions, the impact of their shared experience continued to ripple outward. Officers trained under Collins carried his lessons into their own work, spreading a culture of empathy and accountability. Residents who had once distrusted law enforcement began collaborating with officers on neighborhood projects, rebuilding bonds that had long been fractured. Even small gestures, like an officer taking a moment to explain a procedure or offering a kind word, made a difference in restoring faith. In the courthouse, too, changes persisted. Security protocols evolved to balance vigilance with dignity, ensuring that everyone felt respected regardless of their background. Visitors noticed the shift, commenting on how much more welcoming the environment had become. For many, it was proof that even institutions steeped in tradition could adapt and grow when guided by compassion and integrity. Decades later, stories of Judge Thompson and Officer Collins were still told, not as cautionary tales but as examples of what was possible when people chose courage over fear. A new generation of leaders emerged, inspired by their example. Young lawyers cited Judge Thompson's advocacy as motivation to fight for equality within the justice system. Cadets training to become officers looked up to Collins, aspiring to lead with humility and heart. One crisp autumn afternoon, long after both men had stepped away from their respective roles, they found themselves reunited at a community event celebrating local heroes. Neither had planned to attend, but fate, or perhaps coincidence, brought them together again. As they shook hands and exchanged smiles, there was no need for lengthy explanations or apologies. Their actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. Standing side by side, watching children play and families chat happily, they reflected on how far society had come, and how much further it still needed to go. They knew that challenges remained, that biases wouldn't disappear overnight, but they also knew that moments like theirs mattered. Each conversation, each act of empathy, planted another seed of hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the gathering, Judge Thompson turned to Collins and said simply, "We did good." It wasn't boastful or self-congratulatory. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the collective effort required to make lasting change. Collins nodded, his eyes glistening slightly. "And we'll keep doing good," he replied. Their unlikely bond had started with conflict but ended in unity, a testament to the power of understanding and the resilience of the human spirit. Together, they proved that even in moments of discomfort, growth was possible. And though their names might eventually fade from memory, the values they championed would endure, carried forward by those who believed in the promise of a fairer, kinder world.